Hello, and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And we're watching a film called Love Me Tonight, which I think should be better known than it is. This is the first I've heard of it. You thought you were watching something different, like you did with Playtime.
I thought, and this is just me being silly, but I thought it was, because I bought it because it's a 4K restoration by Kino Lorber, but I thought it was of 1 Hour with You, which also stars Chevalier and Jeanette MacDonald, but it's a Lubitsch film. So I thought we were watching a Lubitsch film, but I was very happy to see it's Rouben Mamoulian, though it's a film that actually, surprisingly, I have never seen. Maybe because it hasn't been available, though I do remember when I was a kid and I would read film books, it did crop up as an acknowledged classic. Yeah, it's just I've never had the opportunity of seeing it until now.
So I looked it up before we saw it because you said we should watch this, and discovered that it's in the National Film Registry, and it's this musical. But I don't know the director, I didn't know the stars. I'd heard of Maurice Chevalier, but I'd never seen one of his films. And it starts, and immediately it's a charm offensive, and I don't mean Chevalier, although he is, but you notice right away, you mention right away, there's such a sense of rhythm to this.
Yes,
it starts off like Stomp or something, right? It's like so it's 1932, so sound has recently come into the movies, and it really, really has this sense of trying anything, experimenting and playing. So the film begins with people waking up on the streets in the streets of Paris.
The streets of Paris coming alive to rhythm and sound.
Yeah, so there's like a cobbler knocking nails into the heel of a shoe, and he does that with a rhythm. And there's people opening blinds, and that happens to a rhythm. And things just start coming together in a rhythm, making a song. And then Maurice Chevalier, you go in on this sort of open window, and you see the straw hat and the silhouette that you recognise immediately.
Yes.
And Maurice Chevalier's then he starts singing about Paris in the morning.
And he gets a great star entrance because the camera goes through the window of this attic, this glamorous attic in Paris, over the Paris rooftops. But the camera enters, you see the hat first, then you see the silhouette, which is just a silhouette on the wall. And then there's this head coming out of this turtleneck. And of course it's Chevalier, right? So it's a magnificent star entrance, actually.
It is. And it's brilliant music. So the music is written by Richard Rodgers, and the lyrics are by
Lawrence Hart.
Lawrence Hart. You were just telling me about. So who's Lawrence Hart?
Well, Lawrence Hart was, with Richard Rodgers, one of the most famous songwriting duos of their day. They had, an enormous amount of hits, an enormous number of hits in the 1920s and 30s. They're now most famous for Pal Joey, so songs like Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, and Zip, and things like that. They were very sophisticated, very romantic songs of longing and yearning, very witty, often with a cynical edge, really, yeah.
It really struck me in this, and maybe this is an unfair prejudice that I didn't even realise that I had, but upon seeing this I thought, there's a sense to the lyrics especially, but also to generally the kind of the tone of the film, that there's so much more energy, both visually and, I suppose primarily visually, but also in the lyrics, like you say, there's so much more energy than I associate with films of this era. It feels kind of ahead of its time in some respects.
Well, it's very much of its time, right? So there are things that recall other musicals of the period. So initially I thought that the whole film would be sung, right? Because there's all this patter of nonsense lyrics, that are basically saying, hello, how are you, and stuff like that, right? Which is very typical of the Busby Berkeley, Warner Brothers films of the period, except these are witty and they're full of sexual innuendo. So they're both of its time, but just like a better, more sophisticated example. Though, 1 Hour with You is pretty great, kind of, and pretty sophisticated. So I suppose this is what Jeanette MacDonald and Maurice Chevalier together, began to symbolize really a kind of, a very sophisticated team dealing with stories that often had to do with sex. Yeah. And this is very much a film about sex. Yeah.
Yeah. So the story here is that Maurice Chevalier is a tailor in Paris, and this aristocrat comes in, has a suit made, doesn't pay for it. So to get his money back, Chevalier travels to this, essentially like a fairy tale castle, a chateau, out in the countryside. Ends up pretending he's a baron.
Because he doesn't pretend, which is important.
Yes.
He's introduced as a baron by the aristocrat who owes him money.
But he wants to keep that a secret.
But who wants to keep it a secret, so he's not lying. Yeah,
exactly.
The aristocrat is lying. That's important.
Yeah, that's why I say he ends up sort of pretending to be a baron, because he's sort of forced into it a little bit. He also falls in love with the kind of, I suppose, the eligible bachelorette of the mansion, if you like, which is Jeanette MacDonald.
Yes.
He encounters her on the road on the way there. His car's broken down and she rides up on a horse, and immediately he's professing his love for it. It's very French.
Yes.
It's very kind of Charles Boyer, sort of, And of course, she bats him away. You don't even know me. He says, "Well, my name's Maurice. Now you know me." Eventually, they fall in love. That's what happens. I mean, huge spoiler. Sorry, but it's a romantic musical.
Yes, it's really lovely. There are very witty things that are done with rhythm. Yeah, there's a whole scene where a deer is being chased, and the deer is kind of going at this leisurely pace, and the hunt is after him. And actually you expect the worst. You expect that the punchline to what is being set up as a joke is that all the dogs will jump on the deer or something horrible. In fact, it turns out not to be the case at all.
You expected that. I thought, no, that wouldn't be very funny.
Well, I thought times have changed.
I must say, I didn't expect that. Although I didn't expect what happened either, which is that he kind of tames the deer and makes friends with it, and he invites it into this little cottage, and so he kind of ends the hunt by saving the deer's life. Didn't expect that. I suppose I expected the deer to escape somehow, and he would be involved in that. Which I guess is kind of what happens, but you know what I mean. So it's still an unusual sort of way for that scene to develop.
Yes.
I really liked, and this goes back to the lyrics. I really like how so much dialogue happens in like rhyming couplets and verse, but it's spoken. But it's spoken, and then a kind of rhythm develops, and then a song develops out of it. But it's like it starts off as these, as like you said, these witty conversations. So they are conversations that people are having, but they just happen to be rhyming. I think it's beautifully witty. And again, this is where the film's charm offensive. It's kind of impossible not to like the way it's doing this.
Yes, I'm not a big fan of Jeanette MacDonald singing. Though I am kind of, a fan of. She's very good at sophisticated comedy. So, she's very good in 1 Hour with You. She's brilliant as the Merry Widow, both for Lubitsch. Yeah, she's very good at kind of doing sophisticated, ironic, kind of very highly stylized humor. As soon as she opens her mouth, that kind of, soprano operetta style singing, which is she's not that great anyway. Kind of,
Yeah, I compared it to Florence Foster Jenkins.
Yes, well, she wasn't that bad.
A little uncharitably, but it's in that sort of tone. It's in that mode.
But I love the energy. I love, there's a real pleasure in the gags. The gags are rhythmic. So actually, it made me think of the Youssef Chahine films that I've been watching. And I forget the name, but there's an early 50s film where this man divorces or goes with his wife to stay with aunts, and the house is full of like unmarried daughters. And Chahine, makes a joke just out of the rhythm of which they come down the stairs. And you realize this is where he got it from. Yeah,
it's all happening here.
Yeah, it's the old aunts coming down the stairs, or Chevalier bouncing up the stairs, right? Like kind of a lot of the humor and a lot of the pleasures in the film, they're really cinematic pleasures, right? Because they're all done through rhythm. Yeah, and it's either the rhythm of a walk or the rhythm of the cutting, or it's kind of, or actually the pace of the film itself. Yeah,
it's based on a French play that wasn't a musical either.
Yes.
Obviously, because the song's been written by Rodgers and Hart.
Yeah, so it's a real cinematic.
But he has been made cinematic,
Yeah.
and I really think that, I mean, this is a brilliantly inventive, beautifully directed film. I think.
Yes.
So like I said, we started off with that thing of the song kind of emerging from seeing Paris come to life, but then while I was reading on Wikipedia, that the song "Isn't It Romantic," which is the second number that we get, was particularly noted as inventive at the time because it begins in the shop and then it starts cutting between different people as the song kind of is carried from the middle of Paris into a car, out into the countryside, and you cut between it seems very normal now, but you cut between these locations and different sets of characters picking up the song in different locations. Well, it's kind of wonderful. And then you end up, the song leads you from Paris, from his shop, to the princess in the castle.
I mean, right from the beginning, we said, almost every shot is interesting, right? It's kind of beautiful, right? There's a real visual imagination right from the very beginning. But then it goes even further than that. So a lot of the jokes are visual. So when Chevalier is kicked out of the castle, right, and he is kind of worried or sees everybody else judge him, he looks at them. And, they're shot from the cameras right down on the floor. They're made to seem huge and looming and judgmental, right? So, the joke and the feeling is coming just out of the angle, right?
Yeah, and you hear, I can't remember what you're hearing, but you're hearing like voices in the soundtrack as well. Yes. He hears them judging him. No. He's just a tailor, isn't that? Something like that.
That's right.
He's just a tailor. So he hears them sort of, they're not saying it, but it's in the air.
Yes.
And then he leaves. Is this what you're getting to? Then he leaves and he's walking away from the castle. And she loves him by this point. She knows that. She's expressed that. And she's watching him leave. And it dissolves. It partially dissolves. So she ends up superimposed over him leaving, going to the train station. And you end up with this amazing kind of set of shots. This beautiful composition of her face.
Yes.
A large close-up, translucent. And behind it is the train leaving. Yes. It's incredibly expressive and beautiful. I love that. I also loved when they fall in love and they express, or she expresses her love for him in particular. He already is into her, and she says, "I don't know who. It doesn't matter who you are." She doesn't know he's a tailor, but it doesn't matter who you are, whoever you are, wherever you are. I love you.
Yes.
And then he's asleep in bed and he's thinking back on it, and then he starts imagining him telling her, "I'm a tailor." Oh, how romantic! She says. And then it goes into split screen, and she shows up as well. And while they're singing together in the dream, his dream. And then when she comes in, it's this implication of they're both singing this song together in their sleep.
Yes.
That's kind of amazing.
It's amazing.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, they're made for each other. I also loved a kind of a marriage of Europe and America. Right, so it's a French chateau. It starts in Paris. It goes to, the French countryside. It's in this kind of great palace, right? But the very finale is straight out of a Western, right? She gets on his horse and chases him down through the prairie
on a steam train,
on a steam train, right? Until she gets her man. I mean, that is very much an American ending.
And
right?
actually, the shot that she gets off the horse because she fails to stop the train, and so in order to do that, she rides ahead, gets off the horse, and stands on the tracks. And the shot of her on the tracks again is from below, and it has it felt like a Calamity Jane kind of hero Western woman shot.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, it's very interesting because the film's imaginary conciliation of classes, that a princess could marry a tailor, right? That's only conceivable in America. Yeah. So the film marries that kind of European sophistication, right, with this idea of American democracy. Yeah.
Is it only conceivable in America? Because or is it gendered? Because if you think about like Cinderella is the lowest of the low. She's working class, cleaner woman. She ends up marrying the prince because she's.
Yeah, but the thing about Cinderella is she is a noblewoman. She's an aristocrat being hounded by her stepmother. Yeah,
was she?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not the same at all. And actually, the thing is that you can imagine, like for example, in The Great Train Robbery, you can imagine a British film in which someone learns all the manners of, an aristocrat and then passes for an aristocrat and then marries an aristocrat. Yeah. But you don't imagine someone who's a tailor and who's not embarrassed of being a tailor and so on, marrying a princess, except in an American film.
Right. I have to give that some thought. It's interesting.
Well, can you think of any British examples?
Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, like I said, the first thing that occurred to me was that kind of fairy tale thing, and this film has a fairy tale aspect, as I pointed out early on. Like, she's a princess in a castle, and you have the three, I think they're aunts, but they have a kind of, they're telling like fairy tale stories, right? And it ends up with this fairy tale tapestry that they've sewn.
My first thought of them, because they're shown also with shadows against the wall, you know, I thought, there's a Macbeth vibe.
I totally thought that as well. Yeah.
Except they're nice witches.
But the film is definitely it's playing to some degree with fairy tale ideas.
It is.
And so that's kind of what made me think of like that fairy tale ending that the person at the bottom of the social pile can fall in love and marry the person at the top of it.
I mean, don't get me wrong. It is kind of a fairy tale, but I also think that it's a fairy tale that is kind of, I see as only possible within an American sensibility of a particular time. I actually also don't think, you know, that it's a current American sensibility. You can't imagine, you know, a Kardashian marrying her plumber. It would have to be like some basketball star or some pop star or whatever, right? Like, you know. But I think in this period, you do get a sense that part of being an American is part of considering yourself equal to anybody, right? And of reinventing your life. And, you know, money matters, but class doesn't. Whereas I think, you know, one of the characteristics of, you know, British culture, for example, is how much class matters.
Oh,
yeah. So it's kind of, I do think that, you know, it's a very American imaginary resolution to class, to classes, to class differences, because actually it's not even class conflict.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah. Well, it's like a Romeo and Juliet.
Yes.
That's British. What could be more British?
Yeah, Romeo and Juliet are both the scions of, you know, kind of wealthy families. He's a tailor.
Yeah. It was interesting actually thinking the American fairy tale thing, because that was in Borat, wasn't it? They watched the Disney version of Trump meeting Melania.
Yeah. Actually, you know, it did make me think of that Borat film because, you know, the revelation that her first husband was 72 or something.
Melania?
No, Jeanette MacDonald.
Oh, sorry. Right.
The marriage that had been arranged for her,
right? Yeah.
You know, with her prince, he was 72, and she married at 19 or 16, and she's been widowed for 3 years. She's only 22, right? And the advice that girl gives to Borat's daughter is, you know, marry an old guy, preferably after he's had one heart attack already.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But for very different reasons. Because in Borat, literally says you can get money out of him.
Yes.
And here it's this social thing, and it's enforced by the parent of the family and so on.
Yes, and notions of ancestry and so on. So one of the interesting things that we looked at is that the Kino Lorber disc comes complete with all the information on the various state censorship boards and the deletions that they asked for.
Yeah, so this was a pre-code film, 1932. The code came in 1930, the Hays Code, censorship code, but it was only enforced nationwide by 1934. So at this time, states were applying it individually, and they were coming up with their own decisions on what they wanted cut. So the disc has, I think, Ohio, British Columbia,
Ontario,
Canada's
Pennsylvania.
Part of it. And they're all asking for different things to be cut.
But interestingly, because then we saw the trailer, because I'm always fascinated by trailers. Yeah, trailers are the promise of a film. It's what the marketing people want to entice audiences with. And some of the best lines that were then censored are in the trailer. And you think, you know, these people in Pennsylvania and Ohio probably only saw the trailer right before.
Well, one of the documents did say we want this cut from the trailer. There was one line about that. I forget which one it was, but so it wasn't. They were seeing the film, and they were saying in reel 5 and reel 7 we want this, and this cut. And one of them said no, the trailer needs this cut as well.
Right.
So the thing that's notable is that there is no pre-code of this film surviving. So what that means is a lot of the lines that we saw cut in the censorship records survived in the film.
Yeah.
What the version of the film that survives is the one that was cut in 1949, I think it said, when Joseph Breen and the Hays Code, I think they were looking at a re-release for the film. They said, okay, we want this actually cut.
Yeah, a re-release only to a very few art house cinemas.
Yeah. And so it was cut when the code was in full flow.
Nice.
And that's the version of the film that survives. So a lot of the stuff that the states were asking for, we're like, oh, we can see that in the film. It's because that stuff does survive. There are some cuts that don't, though. We don't know what they are.
We don't know what they are,
Well, we know what they asked for, but they're not in the film, obviously. That film does not exist.
Yeah. We can't finish a discussion of Love Me Tonight without talking about Myrna Loy.
Oh.
Right? Because, Myrna Loy is one of the great stars of the classic period. And this was done just before she became one with The Thin Man.
Right.
And she's a joy to watch and also completely wasted, I think.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I loved her. I thought, God, what an nymphomaniac. I thought she was stunning, and actually, it was when she was showing up on screen, and she's like lying down on the stairs, and she wakes up and she sees, oh, a man, and then she looks up, oh, it's just my cousin, and that's around the time I was thinking, God, this is one of the most glamorous looking films I've ever seen, and I think to some degree is everything that's happening in that castle is beautifully shot. The hair is beautiful, the makeup and the dresses, and the lighting is astonishing, and also the quality of the transfer, the 4K restoration,
it's beautiful,
is unbelievable.
Yeah.
But I think it's her appearance and her, and I tell you, because what's glamorous is not just the look, but it's
her attitude,
stance, gesture, and it's all her that made me realise that.
Yeah, and actually she's got that so much more than Jeanette MacDonald.
Yeah.
Yeah, a kind of an insouciance, an ease that Jeanette MacDonald. Jeanette MacDonald always comes on a bit too emotional. She kind of overstates things a bit, whereas Myrna Loy is like almost a definition of cool. Even when she's on the hunt for a man, she's kind of slouching.
I'll tell you what it reminded me of. It reminded me of the dynamic between Daisy and what's her friend's name, Jordan, in The Great Gatsby. Well, the 2013 one in particular is what I'm thinking of, with Carey Mulligan and Elizabeth Debicki, which is interesting because Elizabeth Debicki this was before she was a star, which I think she really is now.
Yes, well, she deserves to be. I don't know if she is, but yeah.
And certainly she's bigger now than she was at the time. Yeah. She was just a character actor in that. But she really had that kind of. Actually, it's a blonde brunette thing in both films. I think like the blonde sort of more. I suppose virginal in some respects, although we know she's been married in this, but kind of innocent, looking for real true love, and then on the other hand, the friend / sister who is devilish and daring and lithe and sexy, all that kind of stuff. It's the same dynamic in both films.
Yes, well, you really must see more of Myrna Loy. She is fantastic. She's one of the great presences of classic cinema, and she's always witty, and she's always elegant, and she's always kind of laid back, really. The other thing that I loved was all the supporting cast. All the waiters and the counts, and it's got kind of a whole bunch of comic actors all doing their bits, and they're all kind of wonderful.
Are they normally, when we watch a film like this that has this great supporting cast around them, you're like, oh, I know them. So were these actors that you knew a lot of?
Oh, yes. I mean, and I know them less than some, but, people like Pauline Kael said, all these people who are below the title, whose name doesn't appear on the poster, they would have been national celebrities, right? They would have been national celebrities the way that, supporting actors in a recurring sitcom in a BBC program would have been in 1975. Everybody would know who they are, right? They would be nationally famous, just not stars, right? So people like Wesley Ruggles and C. Aubrey Smith and people like that, they would all, they were all national names, but not stars. The film wasn't built around them.
So, tell me about Rouben Mamoulian. Because I don't know him I've not heard his name till today.
Rouben Mamoulian is one of the most famous directors in Hollywood history. He's less well known than some other people because he didn't have as many hits, and also because he returned to Broadway very regularly. And so he did things like Oklahoma on Broadway, right? But in the 1930s, let me just look him up in IMDb and then I'll go through his credits. He had very big hits in the early 1930s. So he did Applause, which has kind of, an extraordinary roving camera. Yeah, it's a musical, but it's kind of known for the movement that it gave the camera in 1929. Then it did what many people, including Nicky Smith, thinks is the definitive version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Frederick March. And it is indeed fantastic. And then very famously, Queen Christina with Garbo, yeah, where Queen Christina's lesbianism is at least more than hinted at. Yeah, it's demonstrated without being said. And all of these films have brilliant cinematic devices, so that Queen Christina ends with a close-up, an incredible close-up of Garbo staring out to sea, which I always thought it was a freeze frame, but actually it's not. It's just her, looking at her future, having given up her throne, right, and on her way to Rome. So he had less success later on in the 1940s, though The Mark of Zorro and Blood and Sand were very big hits. And then really, from that period, nothing really stands out in film, though very much, he is a figure on Broadway as well. But then he does Silk Stockings in, I think, 1957, which is a Cole Porter musical with Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse,
right,
in which, it's just fantastic, with music by Cole Porter. Just the color, the use of color alone is a thing of real beauty in the film. Yeah, so a very distinguished career, though he never reached the heights that he had in this period, in the early 1930s. I mean, if you think about this run of films, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Love Me Tonight, and Queen Christina, that is kind of something, really.
Yeah. And we were commenting how expensive this film was, because on the Blu-ray as well, there are these production documents with the breakdown of budgets and things like that. And the overall budget was just under $1 million.
Yeah, and this is
very expensive for the time.
It is, especially, we had this discussion last week that the Philadelphia Story cost more or less the same as this film, but this was like in 1940, right? And then we talked about The Shop Around the Corner costing half. Yeah. And you can see why, in a way, the sets and the costumes, and they're all of a different order. But it's also like a considerable amount of time later when, costs kind of rose very considerably. Yeah, by 1940.
And we also noticed that $210,000, over a fifth of the budget, was on the cast, which you said sounded like quite a lot.
Yes, and I think a lot of that must have gone to Maurice Chevalier, actually.
Yeah,
who's billed above the title on his own. So this is before they began to be co-starred. Yeah,
and we should talk about him because we've not talked about him yet. He is the guy.
Oh my God, I think he's one of the most fascinating kind of figures in 20th century show business. He was a working class guy from Menilmontant, which is like the equivalent of saying you're a Cockney or something in London, right?
Right. Is that like an area of Paris?
It's like an area of Paris. It's like a real working class kind of poor area of Paris. And in France, him being from Menilmontant is part of his star persona, whereas of course, in America he personified sophistication and class and so on. He made a very famous pairing with Miss Tinguette, a huge star in France, in the period just, around and after the war. Because the thing about Chevalier, I mean, I don't know when he was born, but he was already on the stage by the teens,
He was born in 1888.
1888, there you go. Yeah, so he would have been 20 in 1908. Yeah, so he's he was in French music hall kind of from then on, and then quite a considerable success, a big star already actually in the teens, paired with Mistinguett. And then, he was a huge hit in London, in music hall. He was a huge hit in New York, and actually his being a hit in New York is what gave him his American career. He slipped a little bit in the mid-30s. I think maybe his last American film was maybe, 35, 37, something like that? Yeah, in between that time.
I can't tell off the top of my head, but maybe.
Okay, well, let's look it up.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm saying this all off the top of my head.
Oh, here we are. So 1934, this is from Wikipedia. In 1934, he starred in the first sound film of the Franz Lehár operetta The Merry Widow, one of his best-known films, though he felt his role was too narrow and repetitive. He then signed with MGM for The Man from the Folies Bergère, his own favourite of his films. After a disagreement over his star billing, he returned to France in 1935 to resume his musical career.
That's right. And basically, he got tainted in World War II, though some people say unfairly, because he entertained German troops, right?
Right.
And his excuse was that he had no choice. Yeah. So he was accused of collaboration after the war, and it took him a while to clean up his name. And then he reappeared with renewed success in Hollywood, again in musicals, making a comeback of sorts with Gigi in 1958, in which he plays the old roue. Yeah, so kind of, an old version of the sophisticated, boulevardier of his earlier films. Yeah, and he remained a huge star until he died, really.
It says here, again, this is Wikipedia, and the source is With Love, the autobiography of Maurice Chevalier from 1960. This is in 1941. The Nazis knew, this is a quote from Wikipedia, the Nazis knew that he was harbouring a Jewish family in the south of France and put pressure on him to perform in Berlin and sing for the collaborating radio station Radio Paris. He refused, but did perform for prisoners of war in Germany at the same camp where he'd been held captive in World War I, and succeeded in getting 10 French soldiers freed in exchange. In 1942, Chevalier was named on a list of French collaborators with Germany to be killed during the war or tried after it. So a complicated time, sounds like.
Indeed. So, so that's it about Chevalier. I love him, because...
Oh, he's fabulous in this. I said to you, he's a real show-off.
Yes.
We said this at some point when he was bounding up the stairs.
Yes.
You were saying, he knows how to perform, and he came from music hall, and it's like, you really feel that he understands how to entertain an audience and feels their presence.
The Apache number, which, is one that is bound to raise the hairs of feminist arms. It brings heckles. I mean, the idea is expressed in that song. But the way he's filmed singing it with his shadow on the wall, right, and actually his performing of it, right, is really quite extraordinary. I mean, he's like a real showbiz animal. You can tell. You can imagine kind of him stopping the show, like, at the palace, like 5 times a day.
When he shows up in the chateau for the first time, and he wanders, he's looking for the fella who owes him money, and he's directed through, and he comes across the aunts, and he says hello, or he says mademoiselle, and they all they're a beautiful little sort of coven of like chattering, exchanging lines of dialogue between them. They're lovely, and they say, "Oh, what a smile!" And you're like, "Yeah, I know what you mean."
Yes, yes.
He can disarm you.
Yeah, he is a joyful presence. I mean, I've shown clips of him before. He's wonderful with Lubitsch, and students find him very irritating. Yeah, because he's so French, right? He's so full of himself.
Yeah.
Always. But I see it as a kind of a joyful, energetic kind of, thing. I mean, he kind of emanates energy and joy. Yeah.
I think that may be the difference. I can understand that, you see. And I think that might be the difference between watching the whole film or watching a clip.
Yes.
I think in a clip, you don't have the context of who he is and all the rest. And, and so you go, who is this guy? Whereas, I think I might have felt the same. I think back on watching Clooney Brown with Charles Boyer.
Yes.
And I kind of think, if I had just seen the clip of him by the fireplace, sort of basically pointing at his dick in that scene, is what he does, I'd go, no, I don't like this guy. But throughout the film, you understand who the guy is, and he plays off the rest. So you have to see it in context, I think.
He is. though, Chevalier is a star and nowhere near the actor that Charles Boyer is.
So Boyer is the better actor,
Yeah,
the more
for
talented
sure.
actor, but he's not the star that Chevalier is.
Well, he was a very big star, but, Chevalier is a star. He's not a very subtle actor.
Yeah,
But he's a great showbiz performer. Yeah. And, sometimes people can be both, like, somebody like Sinatra, but usually they're not.
Yeah.
So, anyway, highly recommended. A really stylized film.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's gloriously inventive. It's so much more. The slow motion.
Yes.
The horses riding off, the slow motion. I mean, is there any purpose to it? Or, I don't know, maybe. But it's just beautiful and striking and so high fidelity.
Well, also it creates rhythms. Yeah. So everything in the film happens to a rhythm.
Yeah.
And actually, the slowing down the film, the speeding it up, it's all part of creating a particular rhythm to a scene.
Yeah, it's interesting because the speeding up happens before that when he rides off on the wild horse, essentially, the untamed horse, and it's the camera is undercranked and it's very conspicuous that it's just going way faster than a horse can actually go, and then that whole kind of sequence that starts with that ends with all the horses, him saving the deer or the stag, and all the horses riding off in super slow motion. It's fascinating. I don't think I've seen super slow motion in film from this era before.
Huh.
I'm sure it must have happened, but it was very novel.
Yes.
The bit where the aunts discover that he's just a tailor. Oh no, sorry, they they discover that he's a tailor, and they come downstairs, and they go, oh no,
Yeah.
but it takes so long to do it. It's
Yes.
really extended. They keep on doing it, and then they go to the room where the drawing room, everyone's there, and they announce it, and then they knock a vase off, and the vase hits the floor and smashes, but it smashes with like a thunderclap.
Yeah.
Again, just expressive and inventive.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't make that decision without some creativity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, the film is kind of musical almost in its DNA. Yeah. The scenes are paced. Yeah. They have a rhythm, and it's either created through dialogue or through the way the characters walk or through the way that they talk to each other in kind of hitting different notes. Yeah. But everything is creating a kind of a pace and a rhythm. Formally, all
the movement of
various
the
elements.
camera as well.
Yeah.
You mentioned movement of the camera in I think some of his other films, but here it's a huge component. I noticed it from the start when maybe it's not quite right at the beginning, but I think when Chevalier leaves his apartment and then he's wandering through Paris saying hello to people, the camera's following him and it's very active.
Yes.
There are movements in and movements out and pans and whips and like I say, this led me to kind of think, oh, have I seen this level of energy in films like this before? And I felt like I hadn't. It's hugely energetic and visually exciting.
So now I must show you the Lubitsch.
Is it going to be as good as this? Because I really love this.
Oh, I think the Lubitsch is better.
Of course you do.
Yeah, I do. Both 1 Hour with You and particularly The Merry Widow, which has one of my favorite scenes, in all time. Yeah, she plays the richest woman in this little principality or duchy in the middle of Europe, in the middle of nowhere. And actually, the film is so witty. Not Varsovia or something like that. Anyway, the film begins by saying something like that, and then it begins to zoom into a map of Europe, right? And it zooms and zooms and zooms, and you still don't see Varsovia. And finally, someone takes out their magnifying glass and Varsovia appears.
That'd be nice. It's like that thing in is it Arthur when he's with the girl at the start and she's a prostitute, and then like his family comes in. And he says, she's a princess of a very small country. They just had the whole place carpeted.
So, anyway, I'm very glad I bought this. I bought it under false pretenses because I thought it was 1 Hour with You. I thought it was a restored version of 1 Hour with You. But I'm very glad that I bought it and that we saw it together.
It was a hell of a discovery, isn't it?
Yes.
Cracking film. I really liked it.
Yes, give it a go if you get the chance. We are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on.
Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much for listening.
Bye-bye.